Ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you to the Sheldonian Theatre this evening for a very special event. It's a great pleasure indeed to welcome to Oxford two people who have been and who will continue to be instrumental in the way that the world does its business, in our public policy, in international events, and increasingly, perhaps, in our private lives and the way we conduct them. For this evening, we are privileged to host Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen in conversation together with Professor Ngaire Woods, the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government. As if you hadn't noticed, Eric and Jared are the co-authors of a recently published book, The New Digital Age, Reshaping the Future of People, Nations and Business. And it promises to be an exuberant and an illuminating hour or so. Only in Oxford could we think of holding such a discussion in a 350-year-old building, this magnificent Sheldonian theatre that was recently renovated and revealed the magnificent Robert Stretton painting on the ceiling. And ladies and gentlemen, just look up there, and in that corner, in that square up there, isn't that gentleman holding an iPad? I am absolutely convinced that Oxford, as in all things, is ahead of the game. It's perhaps only in Oxford that we could hold an event like this in such a magnificent setting. But if you'll allow me to suggest, this is what makes Oxford unique among its peer universities. Our take on the future is defined and buttressed by our past. Almost 1,000 years of excellence in teaching and research does something to a place. When you have all that history behind you, there's only one place to go, and that is to the future. Now, this evening, neither of our guests will need much introduction. Eric Schmidt is the executive chairman of Google and is also a member of the International Advisory Board of the Blavatnik School of Government. For a decade, from 2001, he was Google's CEO. And one can put the responsibility for Google's spectacular rise over that time firmly at his door. He's an advisor on science and technology to both the US and UK governments, and amongst other positions and distinctions, he is a trustee of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, of which he is one of their most distinguished alumni. He did his doctorate in computer science at UC Berkeley, which took him originally to California, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, Jared Cohen is a man who both records history and makes it. He's currently the director of Google Ideas and an adjunct senior fellow of the US Council on Foreign Relations. He served under both Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton at the State Department, a cross-party feat that few US public servants have managed to pull off, latterly advising on counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization. He's also been serving as a special advisor on Afghanistan and Pakistan. His first book was on Rwanda genocide, and earlier this year he was named by Time magazine as one of its 100 most influential people. And he's been credited by Condoleezza Rice as changing the way that US foreign policy operated under the emerging influence of social media. And I am delighted to say that he is also an Oxford graduate. He was a Rhodes Scholar, having studied international relations here after his first degree in Stanford. Now, Ngaire Woods needs even less of an introduction. She is, of course, the inaugural dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and she's professor of global economic governance. I can't think of anyone in Oxford more qualified to explore with our guests the way in which technology will influence all of our futures and the way in which it will even shape world events. And so it's a great pleasure for me to welcome both of our guests this evening and to hand over to Dean Woods.
Well, good evening. The format for tonight is we're going to begin a conversation here on the stage just to ensure that we get some of the core ideas of the book explained by the authors. And then pretty quickly, I'd like to turn to you to get some questions. I was going to say reactions, but given that there's more than 10 people in this room, let's just have some quick questions so that we can hear some reactions from lots of you and really make the most of having Eric and Jared here to answer in person. So let me start then, Eric, with what the new digital era means for governments.
Well, first, let me say it's an honor to be back here. I've been here a number of times, and I've had the nicest time, and I've been most welcome by both the Vice Chancellor, by your operation, and I think this new school that is being built here in terms of government, it has a good chance of becoming one of the greatest schools of impact because of the confluence of events which are largely laid out in the book now. So it's a fortuitous timing that the book and your school and so forth and these ideas are coming out. When we started this, and Jared, you should talk a little about your motivations as well, we didn't know what we wanted to write about. We just knew that there was a new digital age coming. And we sort of discovered that the story is really about what's going to happen to the 5 billion people that are going to join us on the internet in the next 5 to 10 years. And in the book, we spend quite a bit of time talking about how governments are going to largely be unhappy with the empowerment of their citizens, especially since the majority of these countries and our people are typically being governed in ways that are not proper. They're not really democracies. There's a lot of issues. And we wandered around the world sort of discovering that. And so I think most of our message is about the positive message that these tools, the mobile devices, will empower people in this enormous way, but then all of the ways in which they will interact with governments, how governments will push back, and how it will change governance.
And I would just add, first of all, it is really exceptional to be back here. I have not.
I think they'd actually put you on stage here, Jared?
I assure you it's a mistake. I have not been back here since I graduated, and I can't tell you, just driving through the streets, looking at my old favorite pubs and places to go and eat, it means that I have to come back here with much greater frequency. To add to what Eric said, we started off writing this book because we were more or less annoyed with the current state of the debate around technology in the world, which centered, first and foremost around this question of, is technology good or bad? And while some might find that intellectually interesting, it completely ignores the inevitability of 5 billion new people coming online. And so our book is an honest account of how this impacts some of the toughest challenges that we're going to face, from terrorism to autocracy to conflict and war. And we traveled to more than 30 different countries, places like North Korea, Libya, Myanmar, Burma, depending on who you talk to, various countries in the Middle East, and even Ciudad Juarez, which is the murder capital of the world in Mexico. And you might ask, why did we do this? Well, the vast majority of future users of technology are going to come from these environments. And the sets of challenges that they're going to encounter with tools that we use every day and that our company is building are going to look very different from the first 2 billion people that are online. And we wanted to stop just talking about these conversations in ways that were relevant to only the 2 billion who are already connected. And so our book is really about that next 5 billion, how they're going to be impacted by this, and what this means for all of us, whether we're states, whether we're citizens, or whether we're companies.
Right, and I have to say I love the global focus of the book. But can we start with the beginning of the book, where you argue quite eloquently that the challenge we face as individuals is determining what steps we're willing to take to regain control over our privacy and security. You say we need to fight for our privacy. So I guess I wanted to ask you, how is it that companies like Google can help us do that? What incentive is there for Google and Google's competitors to help individuals protect their privacy? Because there's surely great incentives for you not to do so.
You know, when we looked at privacy, we decided to include privacy and security in the sort of same context. And I think the first sort of mental thing you have to get through is that the world is going to get connected with technology that looks an awful lot like the technology that we see going forward. So once you accept that, it has some implications and some responsibilities. So, and we see security and privacy as sort of related to each other. So for example, companies like Google have an absolute sort of expectation and responsibility to you to keep your information secure. Right? It would be horrendous if information that you had entrusted with the company was somehow illegally, immorally stolen, leaked, what have you. It would be a violation of every aspect of trust that you could imagine. But you have a responsibility as well. The judgment does not just end at the company. So these are powerful new tools that can be used, misused by yourself, et cetera. And there are obvious things that you should do. For example, you should change your passwords. And you should change your passwords so they're not the same. If you'd like to understand why, think about the Mr. AP Twitter guy 2 weeks ago who caused the market to go down for about 5 minutes and $200 billion of losses. You know, these are material changes, especially to him. Don't install malware on your computer without authorization. And if you'll forgive the plug, I would encourage you to use the free and fabulous browser called Chrome, which has never been broken in this context and is by far, and if you care about security, you should use Chrome. If you don't care about security, you care about speed, you should use Chrome. If you care about price, you should use Chrome. You should just use Chrome. So,
I'm not sure I'm allowed to let you get away with this.
It's the best free advice I'll give you today. But from a security perspective, it matters. So to then say to the question, how do the incentives work?
Yep.
Well, the incentives are quite interesting because governments have an incentive to react to threats in a hawks and doves matter, where whenever there's a bad thing, the government is likely, or the people are likely to give up some of their privacy in return for that. And so we worry about, in this fight between hawks and doves and privacy and security, that the security police always win. And it's not so much of a problem in the Western world because there are established notions of privacy and security, but in many countries there's no doctrine at all of whether people have privacy. Jared points out that the average person in an authoritarian state has no privacy at all, so to them they don't have anything to lose. So what we worry about is that as people begin to do bad things online, it'll be used to justify restrictions on content or behavior. The businesses have similar objectives. In some cases, in Google's case, for example, we would argue that a privacy violation of you that we caused would cause you to switch to a competitor. So we see it as a reputational cost. And I think that's ultimately how it gets disciplined. Furthermore, if Google did something particularly bad, which we're obviously not going to do, there would in addition be lots and lots of press. There would also be calls for regulation.
And Eric, let me add something to the citizen responsibility, because whether you're in Saudi Arabia or in London or some other part of the world, you will observe a common trend, which is kids coming online younger and faster than at any other time in history. They're coming online and doing and saying things that are far beyond what their physical maturation process will allow, kind of away from their computers. The argument that we make in the book is parents are going to have an increasingly important role to play and are going to have to change how they talk to children. So in a Western democracy, which is socially more liberal, one could make the argument that parents should talk to their kids about the importance of data permanence, online privacy, and security years before it's relevant to have the sex talk with them. And we actually believe that. Look at a place like Saudi Arabia. It's probably unlikely that they're going to have the sex talk at a young age, but you can imagine a situation where you're parents of a girl who, let's say, is 9 or 10 years old. You can imagine that girl not being aware of the complicated laws and horrific laws that exist for women in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, saying and doing things online that are inappropriate, which at the time might not matter, but later on in life could serve as a digital scarlet letter that could have serious implications in the physical world. Those parents are going to have to talk to their child and their young girl about the implications of what she says and does online. Ultimately, we believe that if parents can do this and figure out what this conversation sounds like, start earlier, start faster, that is ultimately the most proactive thing that can be done to safeguard our privacy and security in the future in every single society.
Right, if we move to government, and again, what's fascinating in the book is your travels all across the world. First, I think it would be really nice for you to just put briefly to the audience why it is that the digital era can be a positive transformative force. So you've both mentioned holding governments to account, but your book also talks about transforming government delivery, governments being able to deliver more to citizens. Where did you most see that?
Well, I mean, you just interviewed the president of which country?
So I spent yesterday with the president of Estonia, who I always had a strong impression of what Estonia is doing, but even more so after yesterday. And I'll make sort of a larger theoretical point, and then I'll specifically answer your question, which is take a country like Estonia, which in a world that's entirely physical has 1.3 million people. I'm not positive if it has a military or not, but if it does, it's small. The economy is small. It's a physically weak nation, no offense to the sort of small country of Estonia. In cyberspace, as the world becomes more connected, here's a country that's able to punch way above its weight and essentially function as a global cyber power. You know, it's #1 in internet freedom, ahead of the UK, ahead of the US, ahead of Germany. They're providing cybersecurity to many countries in transition, Libya, Burma, a number of others. They're literally providing encryption.
Well, all of the government services in the country are provided online.
They even vote online. 25% of the country votes online.
So they may represent the future of governments, at least in the Western world.
Of course, we didn't visit Estonia.
But here's the thing.
We visited the tough countries, not the fun countries.
But here's my question about this. For a government to deliver so much online requires all of its citizens, each citizen, to give the government huge amounts of information about themselves. Under what conditions should they trust giving the government that information? Not because the overweening authoritarian state might abuse it, but because the government might dissipate, the information could so easily fall into the hands of others.
Well, we managed to, for the purposes of this discussion, we get the right to imagine a competent government that doesn't itself screw up, right? Okay, so with that as an imagining, right, you can imagine a country that's extraordinarily efficient with respect to this information, that it uses your digital identity to provide digital services, it uses them to provide resources that are measured to outcomes and so forth. The gap between e-government, as I'm describing in this perfect and mythical country, apparently does not exist, and the reality of how government services are delivered is so vast, it's hard to comprehend. The governments today spend all of their time providing services without checking whether they work, without measuring the outcomes, without measuring whether they get to the people. This is true in education, it's true in social welfare, and so forth. So it seems reasonable that in our lifetimes, governments will eventually, citizens at least, will complain that the governments are the most inefficient aspects of their entire world, and that the government taxes and so forth that they pay could be used more efficiently, right? And I think most people would say that everyone's in favor of making government services delivered more efficient. This is one of them. I want to go back to your question, however. There's this prejudice that somehow, if you take all the citizens of a country and you connect them, you can get a 1984 police state. But there's this prejudice that somehow that everyone's going to get registered, that there will be huge surveillance, that we'll use various forms of face recognition, we'll know wherever people and so forth. There are a number of reasons to think that that is effectively impossible to create, and that's sort of one of the conclusions from the book, although it's easy to imagine it technically. And the reason is that there are too many ways in which citizens can get around such systems, that the technology is naturally empowering. There are too many ways for citizens, for example, to use cryptography to hide their communications, to change the software to report their locations in different ways, and so forth. And if you go through that thought experiment for a while, what you ultimately conclude is that even the most evil government will fail at putting in this kind of a police state, and that on balance, the power moves to the citizens, not the government. And that's a new conclusion in our book, compared to the traditional statements of how these things play out.
The other complicated, if I can just add one thing to this, the other complicating aspect for dictators, in the book we describe this as a dictator's dilemma. Let's take a country like Iran, terrible theocracy, dictatorship, 72 million people in the country. In the future, the entire country will come online. Every one of those citizens will have multiple email accounts, multiple chatting services, multiple social networking profiles. The country may remain 72 million people, but in cyberspace it'll look closer to 500 million people.
So the core aspect of our argument is that you cannot run a modern, functioning, current year country without some level of connectivity to the internet. We visited North Korea, which is the least connected, I think, probably by far. And Burma, Myanmar, which is the most recently second in that list, although improving, we think, fairly rapidly. And even those countries can't function without a certain level of connectivity. And once you let the connectivity in, the ideas come in, the pressure, the social pressure, the surveillance by citizens of their government and their government activities, and the process begins. It may be up and down, it may tight, but the message overwhelmingly is that you will not be able to have absolute control over the citizens in your country because the advent of these communications technologies. That countries like North Korea are an artifact of a historical model where you could do this, you cannot do it in the future, there will be no new ones.
But so just to come full circle back, so to the question, how should we protect our privacy? How should we deal with the security issues? If I can caricature your answer, it's, well, you can trust Google. You can trust Chrome. And are you saying that we don't need that same level of trust in a government if we're going to move to e-government?
No, I was giving a facetious example because at least in America, everyone assumes the government's incompetent.
Right.
I won't speak for the UK government, but it's probably more competent than the US since everyone in the US thinks it's the worst. So there. But that's the, and I have no idea if there's any facts in what I just said. I'm just talking about perception.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there's every reason to think that governments can deliver services as efficiently as businesses with modern information technology. It is a political decision to run your government in an efficient way. There are many examples in democracies, as best I can tell, where the government is not fundamentally organized to deliver services efficiently. It serves other needs, such as full employment, employment for specific races, specific transfer payments, and the ubiquitous corruption. The number one issue when you talk to people in countries that we visited is not political freedom. It's shocking. It's corruption. The political freedom is not first on the list. I, of course, as an American, walk in and say, well, they're censoring this, so they won't let you say that. We don't care. What we care about is that we cannot build businesses, the banks don't work, we have all these payments. It's highly, highly efficient. Technology can be used in government to control corruption because money leaves a digital trail. So that alone, right, would be a huge improvement.
So in the book you say that each state will attempt to regulate the internet so as to shape it in its own image. It's a really interesting reflection. Jared, is that what it's doing in the United States? Is the United States shaping and regulating the internet in its own image?
Well, so the way to think about this, which will answer the question, is every state has a set of laws, and by the way, those laws are sometimes hard to implement even in the physical world. It's natural that cyberspace, which is not some sort of weird parallel universe, but in fact an extension of the world we know, it's natural that states will try to replicate the laws of the physical world in cyberspace. This is why you see subtle distinctions between two democracies, the US and Germany, for instance, around free speech. Germany does not allow neo-Nazi hate speech. US under free speech rights does. So you see that distinction online as well. So subtle differences exist between even some of the world's biggest democracies. The sort of scarier thing that we talk about in the book is, 57% of the world's population lives under some kind of autocracy. It's natural that those states will try to most heavily regulate the internet, and the fear is that you could see a balkanization of the web. If that happens, it paves the way for things like states banding together to edit the web in collaboration. You could imagine an autocratic cyber union. You could imagine a Sunni Islamic web.
No, but think about Iran was upset about Google Earth. So they announced they're going to have Iranian Earth, which is Google Earth. This was announced 2 weeks ago. They're just going to omit Israel. Right? Now just think about it for a while. How crazy are these people, right? Time to get a new leadership that can actually say, okay, the physical map is the physical map. This is their logic.
Well, what we find in the Blavatnik School is once we start calling governments terrible, everybody is on the list somehow from some region.
Well, given a choice between the UK and Iran, I think you'd take the UK.
But let me come...
I'm into relative hierarchy.
But let me come to what I sense is a slight disagreement between the two of you, because this is kind of fun.
We like fun.
I couldn't work out in your book on the issue of balkanization where you came down in the end. Is that because, Eric, you believe that that's not going to happen, but Jared, you believe it is?
Eric?
I think we argue, right?
Yeah.
My religion is an open and free internet. Jared has been fully trained here at Oxford to understand that governments have power, right? So I believe I will win, and he thinks governments will win, right? And we want to make sure that I win.
And we're both sufficiently obnoxious to really believe that we're going to win.
But let me give you an example of which I think begs this point. So we do in fact have a balkanization problem in China. The Chinese, as you know, filter the internet. They take out information which they deem inappropriate, which all of us would agree is reasonable political speech and should reasonably be there. So they ban Facebook, they ban YouTube, they ban most of the other social networking sites because they can control them, and along the way a local network which is called Weibo, which looks a lot like a combination of Twitter and Facebook, has emerged with roughly 500 million users. Pretty interesting. And it's governed by their censorship laws. So my question in China, when we were of course there as part of our voyage, was what's it really like on Weibo? Is it possible for the Chinese government to fully censor? There's an article, I don't know if this is true, that alleged that they have 30,000 citizens whose jobs are to censor the social networks of this evil and hateful political speech, also known as stuff that we think should be there. And the answer is they're losing. And why are they losing? Because citizens are so upset about the environmental damage being done to their one child, right, that they're willing to record, do the equivalent of tweet, which I guess is Weiboing, and take pictures and leave a permanent record of their protest about the evil actions from their perspective as citizens by their government, which is harming their families. So there is a line where this balkanization stops. And I can say, I think with authority, that it lines up with the health of your child, right? That a parent is willing to risk, by the way, a permanent record of their demonstration against the government, which is largely illegal in China, right? Because they're so upset about what's happening by their government. There is a line.
Well, also in China, at the risk of being on the right side of history, let me pick on China a little bit further. And you currently have 600 million people connected to the internet in China. The country's roughly 1.3 billion people. That means 700 million people are going to come online in the next decade. The first 600 million, if I can generalize, are largely Han Chinese living in urban parts of the country. So these next 700 million, they're going to be rural, socioeconomically deprived, ethnically and religiously diverse. It's going to look extremely different from the first 600 million that are coming online. And there's no dictatorship or autocracy anywhere in the world that has been fully tested with a scenario where their entire population is connected, because it's always the most diverse parts of the country that lag behind because these governments deprive them.
Great. Well, look, last question before I turn to the audience. The latter chapters of the book are about technology as an equalizer, and that has both an inspiring quality to both of you and also a scary quality in the book. But my question is a different one. Is technology an equalizer of your businesses as well? And what does that mean for Google?
All of us, when we did the internet originally, thought that the internet was a great leveler. And we had a notion that somehow it would produce a distance-independent middle class of equal opportunity for every human being. I would observe that meant that we couldn't do math, we didn't understand power laws, and we hadn't studied socioeconomics, politics, or science, all of which was true. The reality of the internet is that, as other aspects of globalization, it produces global winners of far greater power than you would imagine. That, for example, the success of Google, which is a global company, to some degree forestalled there being Googles of different ownership in each country around the world. It's more economically efficient, it's more engineering efficient, it's more scalable to have one Google where they can serve all of that rather than having 200 of them. That's called globalization, and it makes sense economically. So you can decide if you like that or not. Obviously, I'm at Google, I think this is a great idea, but the fact of the matter is you can have a political view on that. The even more disturbing view, if you don't like that, is what happens with the average citizen. Because I've always assumed that our work was to the betterment of mankind. Mankind includes everybody, including people that are not in the US and the UK. So that's roughly 7 billion people. We want them all to rise. Well, it turns out that in doing the book, we discovered that the people at the bottom of the pyramid do in fact benefit from the internet. And they benefit seriously, right? Like all of a sudden they get information about medicine and entertainment and so forth that they would never have had otherwise. They go from no information to some information. For them, it's life-changing. But if you look at it, the rest of us, right, thus in the first world, the first internet bandwidth world, we benefit enormously from the changes that occur. And the gap, in fact, becomes greater. So I wish I could tell you that our book concludes that the world will become a more egalitarian place, a more equal place, a more fair place. That's not what we conclude. We conclude that this is going to happen, that the gaps in fact everyone gets better, but the gap in fact gets larger, and that's an unsolved problem in my view.
I am just going to press you one more time though on the just to round back to the beginning of our discussion. So one of the reasons why we should trust our data with Google is because if Google misuses our data, we can switch to a Google competitor. Mm-hmm. So competition is the essence.
Of course.
Yet, as you rightly said, there are great economies of scale. So which way is it going to go for Google? Are we going to see a bigger and bigger Google with no competitors, or will technology be the equalizer? And in 5 years' time, there'll be Google's as big as Google that are not Google competing.
Well, we have a Google as big as Google, which is called Microsoft, which has more engineers, more cash, more reach, and more sort of
Lobbyists.
There is in fact a large entrenched player, which keeps, I think, everybody honest, or in their case maybe misbehaves a couple times. Look at their most recent ads.
And the trend is?
Well, we hope to win. It's called competition. But the fact of the matter is, I think that these markets will not produce a monopoly provider, which is really the question you're asking, because the internet does not allow for monopoly behavior. It may now allow for monopoly behavior by governments, but it does not allow for monopoly behavior by any of the corporations because of the nature of connectivity and because of the fungibility of access. People can just move from thing to thing. And I would argue, for example, that, let's take my favorite current example is the Android platform. We have 900 million of these phones that have been activated. It's an extraordinary achievement by the team. There'll be 1 billion of these phones in use around the world by this summer. Right? It's on its way to becoming the single most important platform. How would you describe this platform? You would start by saying it's free and we'll give you the source code. That's the best insulation that you could possibly imagine against the misuse by its owner. Ask its competitors, will they give you the source code? And they won't.
Great. Now to you. Some questions, comments. It's all right. We're not going to hold your data, you know. Yes. The lady.
Hi, I want to first thank you both for speaking to us today. My name is Tenzin, and I'm a first-year student here at Oxford. In 2010, Google had negotiated and threatened to withdraw from China, and I know that was an incredibly historic statement because a lot of American tech companies that have gone to China in the past have actually, in my opinion, abandoned the very principles that they were founded on, the principles of freedom of information. So I want to know now, what is Google's role in China? And have you played a part in pressuring other technological companies, American tech companies that were founded on this freedom of, on this notion of freedom? Have you pressured them and had negotiated with them to ensure that China needs them as much as they need China?
So I did the negotiation with China in 2010, and I can tell you that I lost and they won, right? That the Chinese government is very, very tough, and do not take them lightly when you enter into these things. In our case, their behavior was unacceptable to us. We were attacked for intellectual property theft. They also went through our records and our email systems looking for dissidents, and they also were busy increasing their demands of censorship, which we were unwilling to do. We moved to Hong Kong. My joke is, you guys told me, It's one country, two systems. We like the Hong Kong system better. So we moved ourselves to Hong Kong. China maintains a firewall, technically a censoring proxy cache between Hong Kong and the mainland, and it forces them to do the censorship. The net of this is that Google does have business operations in China, which we're quite proud of. We do primarily international advertising. We do some amount of search through the censored firewall. And a completely alternative interpretation of what's going on is the Chinese government wants to protect its domestic industries. So it does not want an American firm, especially one committed to free information, which they're obviously not committed to become a major force in the country. So our market share stays in the 15-20% range, and the local competitor maintains majority share. I think that that's a stable situation, but I want you to know that the role in China of Google is completely determinable by the government. They have the ability to shut us off by virtue of these firewalls, which exist for many companies, with a moment's notice, and they can do it on a whim. You know, one day they'll wake up and they say, we don't really like Google, so they'll cut off half of the access to Gmail. Our citizens use things called VPNs to get access to that, and then they shut down the VPNs. So again, it's a fight, and it's an ongoing one.
Next question. Yeah, Aparajita.
Thank you. So my question is about public service delivery and how companies can help government. So like you said that a lot of delivery will happen on the internet, like it happens in Estonia. And you also said that internet is giving benefits which need to be sort of redistributed, which makes the role of the government bigger in dealing with technology. What do you think the governments can do better while working with companies like Google to redistribute the benefits of internet and also use technologies to deliver better services?
Well, I think you're asking sort of the e-government question, which is and I would start by doing a thought experiment of what would be if you didn't have government today and you had to form one using new principles, how you would do it. Well, the first thing is you'd ask all your citizens to have some way of having a digital account. And the incentive you'd give them is any service they receive from the government that involved transferring money to them, they'd have to have an account, which would give you 100% coverage of everybody, because everybody benefits from government services in some way. So with that, then you could begin a service history and treat citizens the way a well-run customer service operation does. I think the question of using the internet to redistribute benefits is really a political question. You can decide, once you have this in place, you can decide, do you want to tax rich people a lot or a little and so forth, but you'll have an accurate discussion. I am shocked at how imprecise the systems that governments have with which they make these decisions. Governments need to make the decisions, they just make them, they can't do data analytics, they can't actually do the kind of studies with the kind of accuracy, they just don't know.
Next question. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. You've both mentioned Myanmar a couple of times, and you were both there 2 months ago. I was there at the same time. It seems to me that there's a lot of scope for technology to be used to address a lot of problems in the country, particularly corruption and also the transition to democracy. What do you see as the role of Google and other tech initiatives in actually combating corruption and assisting in that transition?
Well, it's a great question. Let me say something first about Myanmar, which is interesting, and we'll get to the core of what you're asking. As you mentioned, we were there a couple months ago. Less than 1% of the population has access to the internet. Mobile SIM cards were roughly $5,000 a SIM card. The president sacked the information minister because he was making tons of money and wouldn't lower the SIM card prices, and as of April they're down to $20. So that's the first answer to your question, which is make access affordable. I would say for a company like Google at early stages in a place like Myanmar, what you want is lots of companies going in there, just having a conversation with the government. What are some of the early things that you need to do? Having conversations with the citizens about what access will look like, not just on the optimistic side, but one of the things that Eric and I left Myanmar very concerned about is the ability for technology to potentially exacerbate some of the ethnic tensions that are there. The country has a 35% minority. We met with the current government, which is largely comprised of the old junta, as well as Aung San Suu Kyi, and one of the things that they seem to be sort of in relative agreement on is, not having such a tremendous interest in making the lives of the minorities better. So Eric points out and often makes the point that when a country is in transition, and mind you, there's more countries in transition right now than at any time since the fall of the Berlin Wall. When these countries are in transition and first getting access, there's a danger period in which what people first experience online can have a profound impact in terms of shaping their view, because it's not normal and part of the everyday experience to be flooded with so much information. So there is, in some respects, a first information strike advantage based on who does it.
That's very interesting. Yes, I'm not sure if we can get the microphone up to there, but it would seem discriminatory not to.
Yeah, I have a question on the role of languages, and do you think that the emphasis on English, which is sort of being bolstered by the whole use of English as the primary language of internet, is adding to the divide that you talked about, and what are your thoughts simply on sort of use of English in the internet?
It's great to be asked that question in the place that invented English. I think there's good news that computer translation technology will solve a lot of those problems. If you look at the current level of Google Translate and voice recognition, we can now do 100 by 100 language translation. So literally, within a short period of time, you'll be able to talk in any language into a phone, and it'll come out on the other side of a phone in a different language and be reasonably coherent. And the tools are getting far, far better. So I think ultimately there's one of the observations in my 20 years of wandering around the world looking at the internet being built out is that for many countries, internet penetration was 100% of the English speakers and the elite minority in the country, who were typically the wealthy, the educated, that kind of group. And they didn't have to deal with the issues that we talk about in the book because the average citizen in the country did not speak the language of the internet. That has changed now. So a couple of things have occurred. There are now authoring tools in pretty much every language. We can do side-by-side translation. There was a shortage, for example, of Arabic content. That's now largely being addressed. There was a shortage of Korean content. That's now largely being addressed. On and on and on. I think we've caught up. So the good news is that while we have an English language bias historically, it probably doesn't matter as much. Furthermore, the most popular language in the world on the internet is now Chinese, numerically. Although we would argue our English has more impact because we're chauvinist about it. I think we'll be fine. I think we really. The more interesting thing to debate is the perniciousness in the view of others of the English, American, Western biases around communications. So as a thought experiment, let's imagine that the internet had been completely developed in China, mainland China, with all of the political views that they have. Imagine that the protocols each had a revocation protocol, a secrecy protocol, a way of deleting the content, a way of suppressing you, and a way of automatically eliminating your IP address. Right? You have a very different internet basis. So we benefit from this hegemony, if you will, of the American, English, US architecture, right, in very, very, very profound ways, which is not going to go away.
Interesting. Yes.
Thank you for your great talk today. I'm wondering how worried are you about other countries behaving like China in basically shutting the door to their citizens to have access to the internet for the future?
We're very worried about it, especially when you think about this next 5 billion. As we said before, most of those next 5 billion are living under governments that are either reasonably autocratic or very autocratic. So it's sort of different levels of extreme. We talk a lot about what China is doing in terms of intellectual property theft, in terms of cyber attacks, but there's two aspects of what China is doing that has greater geopolitical implications. The first is with every single attack, with every single theft, and with every single act against dissidents, They're essentially setting precedents and pushing the envelope to see what they can do and get away with without any kind of a response. Since we certainly don't know at what point a cyber attack becomes so severe that it warrants a physical world response. The fourth piece of this, which is in some respects the most important, is most of the world's technological infrastructure has still not yet been built. So again, you think about all these autocracies in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in different parts of Asia. Who's going to build their infrastructure? There's only so many companies in so many countries that have the ability to do this. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is you can imagine a type of Cold War type scenario emerging where different countries start developing different spheres of cyber influence depending on different views around how they think the internet should look. And that's going to matter. If Huawei builds out all of Africa, there's serious implications to what kind of trapdoors exist within their infrastructure.
So can I just pick up on the cybersecurity point? Cybersecurity emerged at Davos this year as the issue that most government leaders and corporate leaders were most worried about and had the least clue of what on earth to do. So it was the issue that they would say, yes, it's my top concern. Do I have any clue on how to deal with it? Do I have any strategy for dealing with it? No. So it's slightly concerning. So I guess my question first to Eric is, where should they start?
Well, let's start right here at Oxford. How secure are the computers here at the university? Anybody ever see a botnet source out of Oxford on one of the open computers you all have? I'm sure there have been. The fact of the matter is that these architectures, which we built, it was our fault 30 years ago, it didn't occur to us that there would be evil people, in governments. It's shocking that Berkeley gave me my master's degree for a network that did not allow encrypted passwords, because it didn't occur to me you needed passwords at all. Right? That's how simple our view of the world was compared to this is a long time ago. So I think the fact of the matter is when you look at most governments, companies, and institutions like universities, you have to assume that various people are wandering around inside of them. That's the first statement. And if you take that view, then you need to figure out how to stop it, right? Which means a lot of employment for consulting companies whose jobs are to sort of frighten you and then take money from you to sort of shut up your networks. My general advice is that you should start by doing an internal cleanliness of your own systems. Are your systems running the latest software? How many computers, we'll ask the Vice Chancellor, how many computers do you think are at Oxford? What would you guess? 50,000? Maybe more. 50,000 computers. It only takes one, okay, to become a problem. And even at Google, right, where we're really good at this stuff, there were a few, right, which we think it's zero, but you never know. So I think a lot of this comes from understanding this and responsible people like yourself, putting the emphasis in it. Ultimately, the technology will improve, right, as these things get tighter, and a lot of the attacks will get better because of that.
And there's one thing that I'll just add really quickly. I agree with what Eric said, but would add, we need to find a way to incentivize computer scientists and engineers to want to serve in government. Right now, you go and talk to computer science students, and the last thing that they want to do is serve in government. So we have to find a way to change those incentives. I have no idea how to do it, but.
Okay, I don't know if I'm completely reassured, by the way, by these answers. Last two comments by two of the Blavatnik School students, Clara and Heining. Just very brief comments, because we're out of time, and then we'll get our replies.
Thanks for being here, and I hope you'll excuse the inevitability of my question.
So how is she as a professor?
Terrific.
I'm just looking for some feedback as your advisor here.
Excuse me. How is he as a boss?
Fantastic. When is bonus season?
Bonuses are coming up, Jared.
So thanks for being here, and for leading me to point to the fact that Ngaire is a terrific professor. I hope you'll excuse the inevitability of my question, but the temptation is too great. I realize in your discourse that just as governments become increasingly accountable to their citizens, thanks to technology and thanks to the wonders of technology, I'm wondering what this means for companies such as Google, vis-a-vis the governments and their citizens that give them access to their markets, and so how, companies like Google can be increasingly accountable to the governments that give them access to their markets. And then my second question is whether Google is political, because ultimately it seems technology may well have a role in shaping perceptions, and I'm thinking specifically of the fact Google changed Palestinian territory, the term Palestinian territories to Palestine. And I'm wondering if you could say a few words about that.
Oh boy, those were easy ones. I think, you know, should you pay more tax was the first, and we don't even need to get to the second. Haining, can I take a quick comment from Haining, and then I'm going to get you to, I'm sure it'll be equally easy.
Hi, I'm Haining from China, and I like to use YouTube and Google when I go back to China. So my question is, has Google given up on the Chinese market because there's too much compromise to make? And has Google ever, or would you ever, compromise your principle of don't be evil for business benefits in the future? Thank you.
Right. So there we go.
I think the students ask the best questions at all.
Thank you, Eric.
Very, very, very good. You must be doing something right here. Let's try to answer a couple of these, Jared and I together. We're certainly not giving up on China. China is an important market for us. There are just limits to how much abuse we can take. And I think a lot will depend on the behavior of the Chinese government. We want to serve the citizens of China. Our mission is to serve everybody. With respect to the questions that you asked, companies like Google are in fact fairly heavily regulated. And what I've learned is that information is very powerful, and that Google, who sees ourselves as a disruptor, often get ourselves into trouble because we're a disruptor at scale around information. And so we're more mature now as a company. So when we do stuff, we at least have the conversation about the people that we're going to annoy before we do it, and then we debate it internally. So in the case of Don't Be Evil, sort of the conversation, Don't Be Evil is a mechanism inside the company to say, hey, I think that's evil, right? And that's in fact how the decisions are made. So think of it not, there's a tendency for people who are not in companies to think of them as static. Think of it as an organic, dynamic phenomena driven by a set of values, right? China being the most visible example where we gave up forward profits because the violation of our values was too great.
On the question of will we give up the principle of don't be evil, it's a simple answer, no. With regards to is Google political, that's not the word that I would use to describe it. Google has a mission statement and a set of values, and let me give you a specific example, free expression. We believe very strongly in promoting free expression worldwide. So to give you an example, we went to North Korea, bastion of non-free expression, had a conversation with the North Koreans about how they can't grow economically if they don't open up a little bit, tried to make all kinds of arguments. We have no idea if they listen to us. Pyongyang is like a Broadway play they put on for foreigners, and we sort of left more confused than when we arrived. But a week later, Google mapped out the gulags on Google Earth. That's a statement, but it's not a political statement, it's a free expression statement. You can argue that there's political implications for that, but what drives the company is motivations and values to promote free expression.
Great. Well, our time has come to a close, and just before I hand back to the Vice-Chancellor to thank and draw this event to a close, we have a little Blavatnik School tradition to ensure our guests go away with not Chrome, but some free advertising for the Blavatnik School of Government. So, Alison, could I call on you?
Oh, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And thank you. I would just like to say that on behalf of everyone at the Blavatnik School of Government, we really want to thank both of you, Eric and Jared, for coming here today to talk to us about the future of technology as the next 5 billion people move online. I mean, you've demonstrated how technology, on the one hand, can serve as a catalyst for effective change, and on the other hand, how governments interact with that technology and can shape it. So it's given us a lot to think about. We want to thank you again.
Oh, well, thank you. And let me thank... I want to thank Ngaire. I've known Ngaire for a while, and I think you made the right choice, right, to change the world. And it was a real privilege. When we thought about what we wanted to do, this is exactly what we wanted to do. So thank you very much.
Good. Good. then thank you all very much. On behalf of the Vice-Chancellor and the university, thank you for coming, and thank you to our guests once again.
Thank you. This is your president.